So hello everyone and welcome back to the viaGood podcast, a podcast designed to inspire you, our listeners from across the globe, to change our world via doing good. Now, regular listeners will know that every episode we have guests that will inspire you to take action against the world's greatest challenges and achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you can learn all about the UN goals or the SDGs in the links to this podcast. So this month's episode is with the wonderful Nancy Tahmo, a Cameroonian Fulbright Scholar at the University of Nebraska Medical Center in Public Health and Epidemiology. Nancy is a global community health professional with a particular focus on the intersection between nutrition and disease states. She works in rural and indigenous communities, assessing risks for emerging zoonotic diseases and tracking the epidemiology of obesity and related conditions like cancer. And we will fully unpick what those terms mean during the episode. Currently, with the Emerging Threats Epidemiology Group, she is completing the first ever one-stop and publicly available document for understanding the threat of pathogen exposures to Cameroonian communities. Nancy prides herself in providing back-end support for advocacy in the communities she serves, and the evidence she gathers continues to strengthen calls for funding and prioritization efforts in underserved communities. Her research interests are global community health promotion, nutritional epidemiology, and emerging tropical infectious diseases. So hello, Nancy. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Cara. Thank you for having me today, and I'm glad to be here. So,
my complete pleasure. And after that introduction, I'm even more excited about this episode. But before we kick off, for our listeners, can you unpick what we mean by epidemiology and zoonotic diseases, and perhaps any other terms that our listeners might not be familiar with? And also, we'd love to know about how you came to do the work that you do. What was your journey here?
Of course. So epidemiology, many people would know what it is. It's all the activities or all the efforts that go to understand how diseases are spread in a community. So it's called like the distribution of the disease, right? Like, who are the people affected? Where are the places, for example, where you have COVID? And at what time is the infection happening? So that's really epidemiology. So everyone does epidemiology by some means. And then zoonotic diseases would be all the infectious diseases that you have come to hear about, for example, monkeypox, that have an animal origin. So animal origin might also be birds. So it's not just mammals. So it's exactly that. So I'm sure everyone has heard about these different things. It's just the term that is different this time. So depending on where you are, my friends have different names for me. But my name is Nancy Tahmo, like you pronounced very correctly. And I am based in the lovely capital city of Cameroon, but currently in California, in the United States. So over the last 2 years, I have been with the University of Nebraska Medical Center, where I work with some of the best research teams on communicable and non-communicable diseases. And that is in indigenous and rural communities in Nebraska and in Cameroon. And on the side, I equally work with the interprofessional team at the university. So on initiatives around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, because of course they matter everywhere in research. And so I was raised by a single mother who I lost my dad very early. So I had never seen her in such a vulnerable position. When I was 10, I had picked up a very rare mix of typhoid fever and appendicitis, which is caused by a specific strain of salmonella. So it's a foodborne pathogen or infection. And so I got it through food poisoning while at school. And so that was very pivotal for me. And I thought maybe I should be in healthcare because I almost lost my life then. And so I had never heard about public health like many people until last year. Of course, I heard earlier, but fast forward, I started in biochemistry at the University of Bamenda in Cameroon, where my focus was on food and nutrition. And then, lucky for me, I met the head of laboratories at CDC Cameroon. She's such an impressive woman. And I fell in love with public health. She made me understand that public health is so dynamic and multidisciplinary. So it's like the combination, again, of all efforts that address the quality of life of communities. That is how and where are people born, how do they grow, where they play, where they work, where they live. So it's example, using seatbelts, that is public health. Many of you might not know that. Getting vaccinated, that is public health. So public health is really a combination of the economies, the policymakers, and then the infectious disease persons like myself. So everything that we do to improve the health of communities really is public health. And so I really pride myself in the diverse experience that I've come to gain. So I've worked in the field of nutrition, biomedical analysis, workplace health and safety, and disease surveillance and health promotion. At the University of Nebraska Medical Center, I'm completing my Master of Public Health in Epidemiology, hopefully in December. And my work has 2 streams now. So I get to be part of a major National Cancer Institute funded intervention in rural Nebraska, so in the Great Plains, around cancer prevention. And I equally work with the group you mentioned, so the Emerging Threats Epidemiology group, where we are bringing together stakeholders and research or technical arms in Cameroon and internationally to address the burden of zoonotic diseases that I just explained. So we use what is called a One Health approach. So One Health is like the collaboration of professionals from very different sectors to improve the quality of life, because we acknowledge that humans, animals, plants, and the environment are connected. That is why I'm really thrilled to be on the podcast today to discuss about climate change, because it has irrefutable impacts on global health. So thank you, Kara.
No, my pleasure entirely. Wow, it was really great to hear your story. I didn't know that was your inspiration, what happened in your family when you were younger. So it's always encouraging to know that real hardship can sometimes encourage a path that will hopefully make a real impact for lots of other people. So amazing. You mentioned there a bit about justice and a bit about diversity, inclusion, and why those are important. And I'd love to know a bit more about the sort of justice element of global health, because I think it would be really interesting to hear like how those two things intersect. And then we will definitely dive into climate change and the impact of that on global health.
Yeah, of course. Justice, I think the way the world is shifting now, we see that we all have different experiences. We all are contributing differently to what is happening in the world. But then the results of our actions fall differently on different populations. And so public health really incorporates justice and equity, because some people have been structurally disadvantaged that we know in different continents. And then some have been given that advantage from the start. So you can't put both people on the same playing ground or the same playing field. So justice in public health really is addressing those communities, that the underlying reasons for the problems that they face today. So you're unpicking, for example, how is the judicial system against this set of people? How is, for example, the economy? Because if they don't have the money, they won't buy the right food, they will be obese. There are statistics that have shown like that relationship between those underlying societal factors and what we see on the outside. So it's really much appreciating that everything on the surface, like the iceberg principle that most people use, has a lot of layers to it. So justice seeks to address those layers to have everyone on the same playing field, I would say.
I love that. And I think you described it perfectly, that almost everything can be related to public health. It's a real pillar. And I think that justice answer really, really shows that. Okay, so moving on to climate change. So you said that you're most concerned with the intersection between nutrition and disease states. And I think it won't come as any surprise to any of our listeners that the climate crisis is impacting our food security. For example, in various countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing a real sort of percentage increase in the loss of animal species across the continent. And the IPCC says that this is only sort of set to worsen. So what impacts do you foresee that this trajectory will have on climate vulnerable countries in terms of disease incidence, but also other impacts as well?
Yeah, it's rather unfortunate that disparities continue to exist in the world, even with climate change, and the vulnerability index is not evenly distributed in the world. A very unique nature of climate change is that it affects every continent, and specific countries, of course, in these continents are most affected, regardless of demographics. So in its 2020 Global Climate Risk Index, the German Watch, which is an organization that has assessed how weather-related events affect countries for 14 plus years. And they provided estimates and ranked countries by which countries are the most at risk of the effects of climate change. And surprisingly, countries that were put in the top 10 came up from all the continents. So Germany was one of them, Kenya, there was Fiji, there was the Philippines, there was Canada. So on the one hand, there is the risk, right? What are the risks of climate change effects? And then on the other hand, there's mitigation. Like countries with fewer resources or poor governance, like you mentioned, may not prioritize climate change or invest in preventing this. So in terms of diseases, the effects are blatant. We can't refute that. And I foresee this changing in both directions, depending, of course, on what we do today. As you mentioned, drought events have led to loss in biodiversity and the numbers that we are seeing today. So climate change really affects directly and indirectly both how non-communicable diseases and infectious disease rates change over time. In public health, we recognize this again, underlying causes of diseases with an increase in the number and severity of events like droughts, floods, you have heat waves, you have hurricanes like the latest that we had in Florida. It kind of threatens the survival of individuals and their families. And when people's survival is threatened, mental health problems set in, injuries set in, because of course those who are directly affected. And then there's the stress, and then malnutrition, so poor nutrition, and then economic hardship. So this all contribute to the incidence of chronic conditions, for example, cardiovascular diseases or malnutrition caused diseases such as kwashiorkor that you would have in developing countries. So since climate change and global warming are attributable partly to greenhouse gases, sometimes it's hard to evenly communicate this threat to communities based on whether they're in the global north or in the global south, because there's the argument that countries in the global north contribute more to greenhouse gas emissions through fossil fuel vehicles. So the perceived threat of climate change, which is also something to be addressed, is different across the globe. So in developing countries, for me, the biggest challenge of climate change, in my opinion, of course, is poverty, water, and sanitation. So how do these two things, or these two elements, really play a key role to these communities going forward? With drought and with all of these climate-related changes, we tend to see higher stress levels, as I mentioned, lower amounts of water, and so lower productivity. Some of these countries rely a lot on agriculture. And so the animals are dying, like you mentioned, and then the plants are not producing as much as they should. And so when you have all these things coming together, really, it hampers on the system that is already broken. And then there's a vicious cycle. So overcrowding, because people have to be displaced with extreme weather in certain remote areas. And then they tend to accumulate in smaller cities, and then causing problems due to all of that, the transfer of infectious diseases, because those who are coming, say, to markets now are more than usual. And so that sustains the diseases that you would see. And why I mentioned water and sanitation is because we have come to understand that those are like the pillars to what you would see in most developing countries. Because in developing countries, right, you have three major causes of death. One of them is neonatal conditions. Another one is diarrheal diseases, so diseases caused by foodborne pathogens. And all of this is because of the lack of proper hygiene and lack of water. So with climate change, we don't have enough water, and there's no proper hygiene. And then people don't put emphasis on that because they're struggling to survive. And then the incidence of all these pathogens. So I've kind of touched upon different effects of it, not just the infectious disease side of things. And I don't know if you want me to discuss about how this affects developing countries as well.
100%. I think it comes back to equity and justice as well. But definitely, I think, the impact that it has on wash or clean water and sanitation is definitely something that is discussed less, I think. So, yeah, if you can unpack that, that would be really helpful.
Cool. Yeah. So with global change, the heat trapping greenhouse gases, there's kind of a widespread effect on how life is both north and the south, and the global south. So this year alone, we have witnessed so many climate events like never before. For example, in California, where I am currently, last month, we had a record heat wave of like 116 with an average of like 70 or so. And these have had really tremendous effects. To date, there is no estimate of how many people died due to that. And so the effects of climate change, right, they might be different across the globe, because now, what are the initial needs of those in the global south? Of course, everyone has the initial needs of shelter, of home, of food, and of course, of a living condition that is suitable for them. But when initially those things are lacking, and then the climate change exacerbates those things, the needs kind of switch a little bit. So in the global north, for example, you would have vulnerable communities, like indigenous communities, that are already in a system where the living standard is very high. And so the effect on them is really greater than you would imagine. For example, in California and on the West Coast, the number of homeless people is increasing. So climate change really has effects that kind of have a ripple effect on every other thing. So we can't say like directly that climate change would affect infectious diseases or non-communicable diseases, but all those other things that people have to deal with every day kind of influence their ability, for example, withstand diseases that they would have, of course, in normal conditions.
Yeah, and I think that's a brilliant, I guess, representation of what's happening in the global north. And we will sort of define what Nancy means by communicable and non-communicable diseases in the next question. But for now, I wanted to ask, particularly because you've really painted a detailed picture of what's happening in the global north, specifically in California, but we often don't see climate change spoken about something that's happening presently. If we do, it's always about developing countries, but it's definitely in the global north seen as something that we're trying to prevent from happening, or we're trying to protect future generations from experiencing. So I've not heard very much. Obviously, there was Hurricane Katrina and various other natural disasters happening in the US and wildfires in Australia and so on. But it's not really spoken about or I've not really seen the connection of, because this is happening, there's a real urgency to act. So it was really interesting to hear those lived experiences that you've had, particularly with the inclusion of vulnerable people in the global north, like people living without homes. So thank you for that. So my next question is about global temperature warming again. We're currently on track for a 1.1 degree temperature increase since pre-industrial times, and we're on track for a 2.4% temperature increase, which the IPCC predict in the worst case scenario will lead to the extinction of many terrestrial species. I think it was 29% by the end of the century. So what impacts is this increasing temperature having on our health in terms of communicable and non-communicable diseases? And please, can you define what those two mean?
Yeah, of course. So communicable diseases would be those that can be like communication, that can be transferred from one host. So a host would be anybody that can affect. So it can be humans, it can be animals. So communicable means it can live from one human to other. And if there's something that affects animals, it can also live from an animal to another human being. And non-communicable diseases will be those that are inherent to people and maybe genetic, transferred from by lineage, but they cannot be transferred to another person, maybe through contact or through inhaling whatever comes off of their bodies. So examples, just to make it a little bit more understandable, communicable diseases, example would be COVID, like we were asked to wear masks because, of course, breathing, when someone has just sneezed, the droplets that come off that might cause someone to get infected with COVID-19. And then non-communicable disease, an example, it's cancer. It's hereditary for one, but one cannot transfer cancer to the next person. And so in public health, again, I'll just do a little bit of teaching of one of the things we use in public health. Okay, so in public health, we have what we call disease transmission dynamics. So how does an infection get sustained in a population? That is, where is the pathogen? So the pathogen will be, for example, a bacteria. Where is it stored? And what animal is storing it, or what surface is storing it? And then how many people are infected? How many people are recovered? That's at a time point in a community. How many people are immune to that disease, for one? How many people are susceptible also? Who can get the disease at that time? And how long is the infection? How long does the infection last in those who are infected? And how is it transmitted? So we try to pick on all of those things to define how a disease gets transmitted in a community. So organisms that are communicable, like I mentioned, examples, you would look at those who are at risk, whether it's humans or it's animals, and kind of list those numbers of the different things I just mentioned earlier, and understand how do these different elements interact. So if someone is sick, someone can get the disease. There's this animal that has the disease that is preserving it. There is how long the person with the disease can transmit it. So that interaction is really important in the understanding of how heat, for example, will cause this disease to be sustained in that population, because seasons and climates influence these different relationships. For example, increasing climates has different effects on different shades. Bacteria, for example, would thrive in very moist and warm environments, and thus multiply and contaminate the water and the food. And so when you have the bacteria that can multiply where it stays, and you have the interaction of the people who are sick or the people who are not sick, sustaining this bacteria in this environment means you're bringing more people into that space to get more of that disease. And so the disease tends to stay. And that's why you see, for example, in developing countries, we have the problem of diarrheal diseases, so foodborne diseases, because in communities where these bacteria are sustained, so they are not kept at colder temperatures, they tend to remain in the environment long enough for those who are infected to continue to stay infected, and then those who can be infected to get more infected. So the biggest influence, I would say, of heat on infectious diseases will be those that are caused by vector-borne diseases. So vector-borne diseases will be those diseases that you need an intermediary, a living intermediary, to continue to give the disease to the next person. Example, which is very typical, is malaria. Many people say, yeah, mosquito is a vector for malaria. And so when places get really hot, mosquitoes and ticks, for example, will tend to migrate to higher altitude, and then tend to come closer to communities, tend to stay indoors in their homes. And so you're having this whole dynamics where what is sustaining that pathogen or that infectious agent alive is constantly in the space where people live, and so tend to increase the chances that the communities experience this disease a lot. And these different vectors tend to be heat resistant. So as the temperatures increase, as they multiply their generations, they tend to be more adapted to the environment. And so heat really has so many effects on how communicable diseases remain in that population and continue to multiply. Another one is rats. I don't know if you know about rats. So rats tend to get closer. Okay, rodents. I think that's a common word for it.
No, I'm not laughing at rats. I'm just very intrigued where this is going. Please continue.
Yeah. So they tend to, when places get hotter, so they are living beings, and so they seek for where they can stay cooler. And so they will tend to come into the homes. And this is very common in developing countries again. So the justice and equity part of things. So they would tend to come into homes. And as they come into homes, they have come from the forest, they have come from nearby bushes, where they have interacted with another set of a whole different diversity that way. And so they come in with all these pathogens that they pick up. For example, one is Lassa fever. A few countries are currently going through an outbreak of Lassa fever. It's something that is caused by those rodents or those rats when they get in and then start eating on the food that these communities have at home, and then defecate on it or urinate on it, and all of that causes the disease to get sustained in that population and then multiplying. Another aspect of heating is that it causes the animals that sustain these diseases to travel to different continents. So it's no longer something that affects one continent. You might see a bird today. Some people study birds. Like you have a bird today in some country in one continent, and the next couple of months in another country. And so when it moves like that, it transmits those diseases or carries those diseases to those different places. And that's why you start hearing of things like monkeypox. And then people mentioned COVID, even though there's no conclusive evidence that COVID was caused by an animal. So all of those different things really cause the sustenance, or you sustain a lot of communicable diseases. But in terms of non-communicable diseases, I would say that the effects are more less direct. So poverty, for example, some people say poverty is like the biggest challenge in the world. Like if we resolve poverty, we resolve every other problem, which has some sense to it. Yeah, so with heat increasing at that kind of proportion, we get droughts, like we mentioned earlier. And so people tend to have less to eat. People tend to have to work too hard to get the money to provide for themselves, to have the well-being that they need. And so it creates food deserts. And as there are more food deserts, and people tend to eat or rely on cheap and available food that is prepackaged and not healthy for them. So they tend to become obese and then have cardiovascular diseases, for example, or diabetes, for example. And so all these different elements and stressors would kind of affect these different non-communicable diseases. Another aspect to it is when people are more exhausted with the heat wave, they tend to drive more distracted. And I think some studies have shown that, like over the last heat waves that we had, the number of road accidents increased because drivers were exhausted, especially those who do delivering. So all of those different things really, because an accident, if you didn't know, it's a non-communicable disease. So it's not just, yeah. So
I didn't know that. Wow.
So an accident is an injury is non-communicable. So all of those things really affect how these different sets of diseases remain in a community. So heat definitely has some effects, maybe not directly, as some people argue, but definitely it has long-term effects on the community.
Interesting. And I think something that I was sort of learning about recently was more also how behavior change in response to climate, as you've just mentioned with the driver's example, can also sort of perpetuate what's happening. For example, there are new species. We are based in the Czech Republic, and there is a new species, maybe I've got the technical term wrong, but a different type of mosquito is showing up here that is usually not found in this country, and it's sort of migrated over. And I read an article, I can't remember what the source was, but it was about since it's getting hotter, people are storing more water, or there is more water around. So in your garden, for example, maybe you have your hose, or you have a water barrel or something. You have more uses for water because it's getting warmer. So that in turn is sort of speeding up mosquito breeding because there's more stagnant water around because it is hotter. So I guess my question is, particularly when the climate is changing, which is changing where diseases are located, it's sort of spreading. Some diseases that were previously endemic to one place is now moving over to another. So in combination with the climate and also with behavior change, how can we mitigate this from happening? not only for countries that are going to experience new diseases, but also for countries that are currently experiencing them? What can we do?
Yeah, and I feel like there's no one size that will fit all contexts. And so very context-specific interventions first is the prime way to go about it. So what are the current available things that community has? Because you don't want to burden the community by having them spend more. And so when you look at the community, assess what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, how can they relate to other communities? And so the next step is educating those communities to first perceive that this is a threat. Because if they don't perceive that it's a threat, one of the models in behavioral change is perceived threat to a disease. So they need to understand, like, what are the effects of this disease on me and my family? And so after educating them, provide the leadership, because mitigating all of these different things that we have mentioned has come down to leadership at some point. So how do people really take the initiative to say carpool, doing carpool, so sharing a ride so that they are not emitting too many greenhouse gases, or having more plants around the home? All of those different things come to the policy and the leaders in place. So drafting policies that are region specific, that utilize the system in place. So who are the community leaders? Who are the tribal heads? We don't always think at that very low level, but public health tries to go down to communities and say, okay, who are the mobilizers in that community? How do you utilize them to effect this change? You have people thinking like this, that they shouldn't be destroying their environment. They shouldn't be throwing their plastics out in the open, that they should recycle. So all of those different things, or those evidence-based measures that we all know of them, need to first be introduced in those communities as a way of life. And so I really believe in the back end work of things, and not just going straight for, okay, do this, do that, and then you're going to avoid the high cost of climate change on yourself and your family. So personally, I really look into the guided and very specific and context oriented measures.
I love that. So more than putting all of the responsibility on the individual, more on providing education and making it more accessible to sort of make the right choice, I guess. Yeah, totally agree. And in terms of non-communicable diseases or conditions, mental health is something that is spoken about quite a lot now in the sort of climate emergency, climate action communities, particularly, I guess, the amount of anxiety and dread that it has on us. It's scary. What kind of work is being done, I guess, both at national and international levels, to really combat that and to support people experiencing ill mental health as a result of climate change, and both directly in terms of, climate anxiety, but also indirectly, because as you say, the hotter it is, the more uncomfortable it might be to work. If you lose your job, that also has mental health implications. So I'd really love if you could unpack that.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that I would say is this: when people don't actually understand the burden of something, it's very difficult for them, right, to even see that as a problem. So I feel like what communities, or at the national, international level, should do is first understand what is the burden. For example, in the Northern Hemisphere, you can easily tell that this is the level of mental health problems in these communities. But when you go down to the global South, there's a problem of first surveying, like, who are the people affected? How affected are they? Because I mentioned earlier, like, these communities don't really see it as a problem. So when you talk about mental problem or mental health issues, I grew up in Cameroon. That was not a term we used a lot. Like, people don't even think of it, because you can't tell by the numbers. Like, this thing you're experiencing is really a mental health issue because of where you are today. So first, being able to have that level of information, and then letting the communities know. And of course, we always rely on international collaboration, because it's not a one problem, or it's not a problem for one community alone. And so where are the strengths? Yeah, some communities have agriculture as their main stream of income. Other communities have the resources financially to help these communities. So how do those interplay, and how do the communities in themselves get engaged? The last time I was in Cameroon, I went to the indigenous communities in the rainforest region, and they actually have a whole forest there, and they rely on that forest. But we have miners and then foresters who would come and cut down the trees and not even provide a means of sustenance, not even provide a means of earning money to those communities. And so they really cried out, like, there is no corporate social responsibility. So these companies or these communities or these different organizations that work in these different communities need to have their communities engaged in addressing all these problems, and they need to be responsible. They need to be held responsible. So policies need to be in place that hold these different organizations and companies that run in these different communities responsible. And of course, I'll never rely to say that education is really the key to having people make the necessary change.
Definitely. And I think in that example you gave about agriculture, I want to kind of return back to food security, which is how we kind of started our discussion. And obviously, well, not necessarily obviously, but as a result of many of the other sort of external stresses, so from COVID to the war in Russia, for example, which is having a lot of knock-on effects on food availability across the world, not only in Europe. And this is leading to increasing food costs, which of course is a problem. So how can individuals, particularly in this context, protect themselves against non-communicable diseases, such as, being malnourished, for example, particularly in this climate? And if you know anything about the food crisis, feel free to sort of elaborate on that situation as well. I think it would be really interesting to deep dive into that.
Yeah. So in terms of food crisis, it's actually a very challenging place, because this is something that relies on how much resources you have available. And so how does change and all of this affect food availability? Because there's availability and then there's access to that food. So you might provide the grocery stores, but how much distance does one have to cover to have that freshly made food? That's one thing that needs to be considered. And so at an individual level, it's only to advise, right? Yeah, you need to eat fruits and vegetables and all of the nice things that we like to say. But how can I really grow low cost food at home? Because there are so many studies that have shown foods that can grow in 2 weeks, that can grow in 5 months, with really available things just nearby the house. And so being able to again go back to those communities and not stand at the top and dictate what should be done, but look at the climate in those communities. Look at what do they have available? What kind of soils do they have available? What kind of subsistence crops do they have available in those communities? And then from there, look at what are the nutritional benefits of this food, and then advise them that, yeah, if corn and beans and potatoes and fish is what you have mostly available in your community, I won't come and say, rely on radishes, for example, or lettuce to have your daily minerals and all of that, which is unfortunate. Most textbooks would have food that people eat in other places. And so really getting that context, it's really important. And I really experienced that while I was in my undergrad, because I did food and nutrition biochemistry. I was supposed to assess how much food I was eating for a week. And all the papers I had, all the estimates I had, first the metrics were different. We used a different metric from what they use in the United States. The kind of examples of foods that they had on were really different. So we really need to come back to what is the educational workforce that you have in this community. So as a student, I could as well do the analysis, right? And say, yeah, if my mom eats potatoes these days, this is how much she's getting from it. If she's eating, we have very different vegetables than what we have in the United States. This is what she's going to get from it. So really enforcing that people grow their individual communities and rely on each other. So again, the leadership in those communities should create a space for them to share that kind of knowledge, that, yeah, this crop I'm growing is what works best for me. And then the nutritionist will say, yeah, I have this kind of quantity of this crop, and this will really be helpful to you. And so fast forward, we hope that it's going to address the problems of non-communicable diseases. Of course, there's always to say that, yeah, things like obesity and diabetes and then cardiovascular disease don't affect developing countries as much. I think it's just because of the lack of information, because I've lived in those communities and I know how they affect them. And so people make this claim because in these communities, people walk a lot. And so they put in the required amount of physical activity. And so if I had a policy in place that, yeah, this is the amount of physical activity you should have in a day, yeah, they are meeting that goal, right? But there's still very high prevalence of hypertension, of these different non-communicable diseases because of other effects on it. For example, salt intake. Salt is readily available in communities, but are they educated enough to know this is not the amount of salt that you should have in your food? Drink this amount of water every day. So really those different things need to really come down to understand the context where you are.
I love that. And I really had never really considered that. I think your example of being a student and seeing the diagram, I even can picture the food pyramid or the plate with lettuce and milk and all of this stuff. It just is a really good example of why representation matters and cultural sensitivity matters. That's like really illuminating to me because I had never thought about it being from Europe. Yeah. And that is what we primarily see. So thank you for that example. That was really interesting. I have a question that I've always wanted to know from a personal perspective because I have a very sort of novice level interest in nutrition. And nowadays with, you mentioned sort of fast growing fruit and vegetables. You can grow fruit and veg in your flat, in small apartments, for example. But how nutritious is this food? And I would even expand that question out to the sort of supermarket level, at least here in the global north, because you were talking about foods that are available in communities, in different communities that aren't in the global north. And I can imagine that food potentially being more nutritious than it is here. So this might not be your area of expertise, but I'm really interested in, are we actually getting the nutrients that we think we are here in the global north, particularly if you buy from supermarkets, foods that are shipped really far, they're often unripe and then they ripen in transit. What are we eating and is it healthy?
That's a very good question because I think all of my fellow Fulbright students who have come to the United States who have had the same approach to things, like it doesn't taste the same.
Right.
How nutritious is this really?
Especially in the US. Yeah, definitely. Agreed.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And I would say that the Food and Drug Administration and USDA, they are doing a phenomenal work. So they have people write down what's the nutrient content of these different foods. Yeah, people would argue that they contain some chemicals. Until proven otherwise, I think we might have to rely on what the labels would tell us at this point, because I think they used a very structured system to arrive at those labels. So of course they get ripe, like you said, on transit, and they don't take like the normal cycle of things. And I feel like it's all because of the kind of seeds they are using. And so there's a lot of manipulation, I would say, in terms of food production here. And how does someone who lives here then get everything that is needed? Knowing all of this, maybe just going the extra mile, relying on spices, the kind of spices that we put on food. Because spices, like in India and in most parts of Cameroon, we've come to understand that these are really rich sources of antioxidants and the kind of minerals that you need. So how do you season your food, and how much fruit and vegetable are you taking? Yeah, because this is what you have available. So your context is that this is it. So rely on the spices, rely on upping or increasing, I would say, how much food you have, and not worrying that it has the different chemicals that we think it has. Yeah, because trusting the system that is in place to make sure that people are providing the right information about the food.
Yeah, what a sad reality. But I would also add that maybe, or at least personally, which might be helpful for our viewers, I'm really trying to buy as much fruit and veg as possible from, say, farmers markets. Of course, I think there's quite a position of privilege to be able to buy all of your fruits and veg from farmers markets. Yeah. But I do think whenever you can, you're walking past a stall and they have strawberries in season, like maybe try and buy those. But also, as you say, we have what we have, so we kind of have to also rely on supermarkets. But I have another question very related, and that is about biofortification, which I'm not sure if this is your area of expertise, but it's something that I was interested in quite a bit a few years ago. And for our listeners, biofortification, I'm sure Nancy actually could give a better definition, but my understanding of it is increasing the nutrient content in certain vegetables, or I guess it can be outside of vegetables. But the examples that I know are, for example, biofortified sweet potato. You can have 100% of your vitamin A within a sweet potato, for example. And some people would argue that biofortified foods are kind of the future because we're having less and less space, and particularly in countries where malnutrition is a real issue, this could be a sort of solution. So from your expertise and from your interests, what are your thoughts on biofortification? Is that a potential solution to the issue that we have, or is it actually like pesticides or something similar like that?
That's a very timely question, because biofortification, I'm quite familiar with it. It started a long time ago. So in countries, like you said, what is available, for example, palm oil. Palm oil in Cameroon, for example, is biofortified. So that's the policy. It needs to be fortified with vitamin A. And so indeed, it is the future. It's one of the things that would matter. And it has been working. For example, salt. Salt doesn't normally have iodine in it, but if you look at your salt, it has iodine in it. So that's like a world, that's biofortified. So that was like,
oh no, don't tell me that. No, joking. Interesting.
Yeah, because then the world noticed that salt was the most available thing to every community. And so how are you making sure that, at least if it's something they eat every day, how do you prevent, for example, goiters? That was very common then. So they decided to fortify salt, and that's the standard today. So definitely, biofortification will not go out of fashion, I would say. It's going to be a thing. And as time evolves, we would see other interventions. For example, seasoning now in my country, I think they started increasing the amount of vitamin A that you should have in it. So it's really those policies based on what is in those communities. So definitely it's going to stay for a while.
Interesting. I will stay impartial on my thoughts on that, but thank you. That was really, illuminating. My next question is about COVID-19, probably predictably. You mentioned that it's not definitive as to whether or not it is a zoonotic disease or not, but it obviously had real impacts on our whole lives, our lives of everyone internationally. It's probably at least the only example in our lifetime that we've seen where something has impacted everyone other than climate change. So to what extent was climate change a driver for the spread of COVID-19? And also, how can we prevent future pandemics, or I guess use this as a sort of learning curve for potential pandemics to come?
Yeah. I think with the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, how they are related. First, it's difficult to definitely say that, this and that really affected it. But how we have come to understand it to date is, for example, people traveling, it's an effect of climate change. Like having so many people travel, having people walking through the deserts and all of that, spreading this disease that was endemic in one region, and now it's a whole pandemic. So climate change definitely affects how people move. And I know some postulates were that bats were one of the initial sources of COVID-19. And so having those bats get closer to communities, because most of them will reside in like forests far away. And so if these communities cut down the trees and then get closer to the forest, there's a high tendency that maybe there will be that interaction, right? And then one of them was the live markets. Climate change also affects the levels of water, right? And so the amount or the number of animals or organisms that you would pull out of the water will be more, because many of them get washed out to the shore, and then people might bring it out to live markets and then sell all of these things. So that was one of the ideas that people had, like maybe COVID came through one of the live markets. So in my opinion, really, climate change and COVID-19, we might understand the actual relationship down the road. But at this point, it's really difficult to say how it affected it, because of course it was spread by droplets, but there's no evidence in my understanding that climate change would have affected how much time that droplet stayed in the air, because it was all based on what we have, all the information that we have to date. So I can't tell for certain that, yeah, this is how it affects COVID-19 or whatever. And in terms of preventing future pandemics, that's a really good question, because I always ask most of my professors who are like senior public health professionals, like, I might be alive during the next big pandemic, because there's a prediction for influenza pandemic. So tell me, what should I do differently? What should we do differently? And so they always pause and think. And I think one of the things that comes up is we don't have a unified system of reporting. For example, what happened in China before it got to other ends of the world, like the information of it wasn't very good. And so we didn't have that unified system of reporting, like, okay, something is happening, you have this number of days to report it, and there should be sanctions for that. And we're able to have that level of database, right, to know, okay, this is unusual in these communities, and people are alert already. Another thing that they always tell me is having preconceptions. So when COVID started, everyone, or many people thought, oh, it's the flu, it's like the flu, it's just going to come. And so all these preconceptions really misled us. And we're not able to address how this disease was transferred from one community to the next. So having an open mind as we move forward with any new thing, we should really put in the right questions and investigate and know, okay, this is how it's moving, this is what we should do. And of course, the pandemic, as we saw it with COVID-19, remained or was sustained due to the factions that we have in society. For example, in the US, political factions were one of the drivers of why we had the pandemic lasting or having its effects up to today. And hundreds of people are still dying in the US every week. So being able, right, to separate politics and health, it's one big thing. And one thing my dean always tells us is public health has become more popular now with the COVID-19 pandemic. They used to hide at the back of their offices, and now they have to be on TikTok, they have to be on YouTube and all of that. So really exploiting, right? We need to exploit these different spaces where communities actually interact, and not be on like scientific publications on like PubMed or some big high-level journals that no one in the community actually reads, right? So really providing the space that we are able to get in contact with these communities and have a relationship with them, so that when the pandemic or something is happening, they don't see a new face just appear in front of them and be like, oh, you should wear a mask, you should do this and that. They already know. It's like, oh, Nancy, that's Nancy again. I will just wear my mask. At least I know Nancy. We have had this built relationship. So really having the public health workforce have a relationship with the communities so that it's easy. There's already the trust, because trust was an issue with the COVID-19 pandemic. So really all those levels, I would say, would help us in the next pandemic from our life.
I love that. I hope there isn't one anytime soon. But that leads me really nicely to the final question, which you kind of already answered. But it's more what needs to happen both at the local level, in developing countries and developed countries alike, or those are quite outdated terms now. So in the global north or in the global south alike, to protect our global health going forward. And I think you've mentioned the change in communications, and you're right, we do see public health announcements on TikTok, which didn't even exist before the pandemic. So communications is really changing. And I love that global health global health professionals are really aware of that. But do you think it's just communication that needs to change, or what needs to happen to protect global health going forward?
Yeah, communication is definitely one of them. And another point that has been exploited a lot lately is capacity building in the respective communities, because we saw with COVID-19, vaccines had to be shipped from so-and-so country to so-and-so country. And that was really a mess, because at some point, some of these countries didn't have a choice and had to accept trial vaccines, because the policies in the bigger countries didn't want them to try the vaccines there. And so the mistrust and everything went down. So really building the capacity of the healthcare system at the local level, so that we don't have to deploy people who will come and be masters in other people's communities. So building that workforce, building that system in place. Of course, holding people accountable. I know there's some push now to say, okay, who needs to be held accountable for the level of devastation that we have due to COVID-19? And so having different levels of accountability for organizations, because global health, right, it's a lot, like I mentioned earlier, it's not just healthcare, it's not just how sick I am at this point. It's really, okay, there's so much migration of people. How are we addressing that? Who needs to be held accountable? Why are people migrating this much? So really having a system to hold people accountable. And always they say a disease in one place is a disease everywhere. So having that joint front, like you said, the communication, having the relationships already in place, like some of the work that we are doing now to have stakeholders on the different zoonotic diseases that we have in Cameroon. So if we already have a system in place, and then this community has this thing going on, we know where to leverage, we know who to call on, we know who to help support and teach, because there's a technical side of things apart from the community being able to say, go out and do so and so thing. You need to have the expertise as well in place. So really building those relationships and the workforce, I think, are the way forward.
I love that. Thank you so much. And we could continue forever, but that is us out of time. Unless you have any final words, anything you'd like to add before I close?
No, nothing much, but just to say really thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and especially to your team at viaGood, and just to encourage listeners and whoever would be hearing this someday to really please get involved with viaGood and do the most you can, because this is a really great platform. With a click, you can do so much good in the world. So I'll steal your catchphrase to continue saving the world. Yeah, doing good. So thank you.
I mean, wow, Nancy, you closed that better than I could. Thank you so much. Yeah, what she said, basically. And I'll leave all of the links to the things that we've discussed in the show notes to this episode. I will leave the download link for viaGood because, as Nancy said, we're a community and we'd love to have you. And all that's left to say is thank you so much for being here. You've been a wonderful guest. You've really given me lots to sort of think about and ponder. And yes, I'll reach out if you have any links that you would like me to share with our listeners. Please let me know, and I will also share those below. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thank you.